Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Good to be here.
Today we're tackling a really compelling economic puzzle. What happened right after the 2025 reintroduction of tariffs?
Yeah, and specifically how that shook up, the fortunes of the 10 wealthiest people globally.
Exactly. It's like tracing the ripples of economic policy right to the very, very top.
Right. So your mission today, if you choose to accept it, is to really get a handle on the direct financial hit these tariffs had on this, exclusive club.
And the economic machinery behind it all.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating, I think, is the divergence. Most of these titans, their net worth just plummeted.
Yeah.
But one person actually saw a pretty significant increase.
Yeah, that's the core question, isn't it? We've got this really insightful article breaking down their wealth dynamics right after the tariffs hit.
And we need to unpack why almost everyone lost big while one person really bucked that trend.
Okay, let's dig in. Where do we start? The overview.
Yeah, let's look at the immediate fallout. The article gives a pretty stark snapshot of the financial impact right at the top.
Stark is maybe putting it mildly.
For the vast majority, yeah. 8 out of the 10, their net worth took a significant hit.
And significant feels like an understatement. I mean, the numbers are almost surreal. Elon Musk, was it minus $145 billion?
$145 billion? Gone.
Just gone. Jeff Bezos down $50 billion?
Yep. Zuckerberg lost $39 billion. Larry Ellison, $38 billion.
Bernard Arnault, $37 billion loss. The Google guys, Page and Brin.
Page lost $36 billion. Brin, $33 billion.
Steve Ballmer, $20 billion down. Even Bill Gates saw a dip, $5 billion.
Right. These are just astronomical sums. It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. The sheer scale of those losses, for 8 of them anyway, it really underscores a key point, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Even with that level of immense wealth, they're still deeply tied into and affected by these big global economic shifts. Policy matters.
But then there's the outlier, Warren Buffett. He gained $16 billion.
The sole gainer in the top 10. It's fascinating.
Okay, so before we dive into why Buffett gained, let's maybe first pinpoint the sectors that got hit hardest. The analysis seems to point heavily towards tech.
Yeah, the tech industry was definitely vulnerable. What's interesting is how these tariffs on electronics, semiconductors, key components, a lot sourced from Asia,
Right.
how that created a really significant headache for the sector. And that directly hammered several of the billionaires we're talking about.
So let's start with Musk again. That $145 billion loss is just mind-boggling. The source points to a couple of things, right? Tesla's costs went up.
Precisely. Tesla has this really intricate global supply chain. They rely heavily on battery tech, other electronics.
A lot from China, presumably.
So the tariffs hit, and bam, their production costs inflate. Directly.
And then China hit back.
Exactly. Retaliatory tariffs from China, which is a huge market for Tesla EVs, that just amplified the financial strain.
Plus, so much of his wealth is tied up in Tesla stock, right? Makes him super sensitive to market swings.
Absolutely. Stock volatility plays a huge role when your wealth is that concentrated. Any uncertainty hits hard.
Okay, what about Jeff Bezos and Amazon? It wasn't just like the gadgets they sell, was it?
No, that's a good point. I mean, sure, they faced higher costs for all the imported consumer electronics and other goods on the platform. That's obvious.
Yeah.
But the analysis also flags disruptions in the supply chain for server hardware, the stuff that powers Amazon Web Services.
Okay, so even the backbone, the infrastructure, felt the pinch.
Right. It shows how deep these tariff impacts can go, even hitting major cloud services.
And then Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, they're pouring billions into the metaverse.
Yeah.
That didn't make them immune.
Not at all. Meta's big bets on VR and AI, they need tons of advanced hardware, specialized chips, devices, often imported.
So tariffs made building the metaverse more expensive.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Increased the cost of those essential building blocks. And that landed on top of existing investor worries about, the whole metaverse pivot profitability and timeline.
Right, compounding factors.
Which contributed to Meta's stock taking a hit.
Okay, moving down the list. Page and Brin at Alphabet Google, and Larry Ellison at Oracle. Giants in search and software, but still affected.
Yeah, they weren't completely shielded. For Alphabet, the hit came from higher costs on their hardware side, things like the Pixel phones, equipment for their data centers. Now, their main moneymaker, advertising, that's less tied to physical goods directly. But the hardware ventures, they felt the tariff costs squeezing margins.
And Oracle, Similar story.
Pretty similar, yeah. Ellison's Oracle saw higher costs for server hardware, which is crucial for their cloud computing and enterprise software stuff. That impacts profitability, investor confidence.
It all connects. Okay, even Microsoft under Ballmer and Gates. Though Gates' loss was smaller, as we said.
That's a key point. Microsoft's hardware, like the Surface devices and their Azure cloud infrastructure, they face some supply chain issues from tariffs. But their dominance in software really provided a buffer, a degree of insulation.
Than Gates himself.
Oh.
More diversified.
Exactly. His relatively smaller loss, that $5 billion, probably reflects a much more diversified portfolio. Plus, his philanthropic ventures aren't really tied to global goods trade in the same way.
Okay, that covers a lot of the tech side. Let's pivot to luxury. Bernard Arnault and LVMH. Tech wasn't the only sector feeling the pressure.
No, definitely not. The luxury goods sector also felt a significant squeeze. Arnault's big loss, that $37 billion, really highlights how vulnerable high-end brands like Louis Vuitton, Dior, etc. are to trade barriers.
How so? Was it tariffs on the finished goods?
That was part of it, yeah. Tariffs on the luxury goods themselves, but also, crucially, retaliatory tariffs from China.
Ah, China again. A huge market for luxury.
It's absolutely critical for LVMH. So you had this double whammy, reduced demand from Chinese consumers because of the trade spat, and potentially higher costs for imported materials they used to make the goods.
Okay, so that paints a clear picture of why most of the top 10 saw their wealth shrink. Tech exposure, luxury market issues. But now, the big question, Warren Buffett. Why did his fortune increase? He really is the exception here.
Buffett's gain is, yeah, it's a really fascinating case study in how investment strategy plays out during trade turmoil. The article zeroes in on his diversified approach through Berkshire Hathaway.
Right, Berkshire owns a lot of different stuff.
And crucially, a lot of companies focused heavily on the domestic U.S. market. Think insurance, railroads, everyday consumer goods companies.
So less exposure to international supply chain chaos and retaliatory tariffs.
Pretty much. It illustrates a core idea. When global trade friction ramps up, these domestically focused, often value-oriented investments can act like a safe harbor. They might even benefit from less foreign competition or shifts in domestic demand.
So while the tech guys were wrestling with tariffs on imported parts, Buffett's portfolio was largely insulated.
To a large extent, yes. For example, the article suggests tariffs on imported steel might have actually helped domestic steel producers.
And Berkshire likely holds some of those.
It's plausible within their diverse holdings. Plus, his big insurance businesses are primarily domestic. They aren't directly impacted by disruptions in shipping goods across borders.
So his gain really highlights the advantage of that domestic focus and diversification when protectionism is on the rise.
Exactly. It underscores that potential advantage in that specific policy environment.
Okay, so we got the who gained, who lost, and some sector specifics. Let's zoom out a bit. What were the broader economic mechanisms driving these huge wealth shifts? The article mentions stock market volatility first.
Absolutely key. Tariffs, almost by definition, inject uncertainty into the market. What will the impact be? How will other countries react?
And markets hate uncertainty.
They really do. It makes investors nervous, often triggering sell-offs. And they tend to sell off hardest in sectors seen as most vulnerable, tech and luxury goods, being prime examples here.
So the stock price drops for Tesla, LVMH. Those were direct results of this tariff-fueled volatility.
Yes, prime examples. Think of it like, storm clouds gathering. Investors aren't sure how bad it will get, so many decide to sell first, ask questions later. That pushes prices down, hitting the net worth of major shareholders.
And it wasn't just investor sentiment, right? Actual supply chain problems were a big factor, too.
Oh, definitely. The tariffs acted like instant taxes on key imported parts. That immediately jacked up costs for companies with those complex global supply chains we talked about.
Squeezing profit margin.
Right. But it also physically disrupted things. Getting the necessary materials became harder, leading to production slowdowns, bottlenecks.
Which further spooks investors.
Exactly. And companies heavily reliant on manufacturing in places like China were especially vulnerable to both the initial tariffs and the inevitable retaliation.
Yeah, let's talk about that retaliation.
Right.
The counter tariffs from China and others, they really amplified the damage, didn't they?
Without a doubt. The U.S. puts tariffs on Chinese goods. China responds with tariffs on U.S. goods. It limits market access.
So Tesla gets hit twice. Higher costs from U.S. tariffs, lower sales in China from their tariffs.
That's the double bind, yeah. A really tough spot. And similarly for LVMH, losing access or facing higher barriers in that critical Chinese luxury market because
Oh,
of the
yeah.
trade dispute. Big impact.
And the article also mentions currency effects and inflation. How do tariffs play into that?
Well, generally, tariffs make imported goods more expensive. That feeds into overall inflation in the economy.
Okay.
When inflation rises, central banks might start thinking about tightening monetary policy, raising interest rates to cool things down.
Which makes borrowing more expensive.
Right. And higher interest rates can depress stock valuations. They make future profits worth less in today's dollars, which particularly hurts growth-focused tech stocks. So it's another channel contributing to those wealth declines.
It sounds like a perfect storm for some of these companies. But they weren't just setting ducks, were they? The article mentions some adaptive strategies starting to pop up.
That's right. Companies don't just accept this passively. We're starting to see, or the article suggests we'd see, things like trying to move supply chains.
To where? Places without the tariffs.
Yeah, maybe Southeast Asia, Mexico, regions exempt from these specific tariffs. But that's a huge undertaking. Complex, expensive, takes time.
Not a quick fix.
Definitely not. Another tactic is just passing the costs on, raising prices for consumers.
But that could hurt sales.
Exactly. Risks demand competitiveness. Then there's diversification, like we saw with Buffett, maybe shifting investment focus.
And lobbying. I assume there was plenty of that.
It's highly probable, yeah. Big corporations engaging in significant lobbying to influence policy, maybe get exemptions.
This whole situation, it raises some really interesting questions about wealth inequality, doesn't it? I mean, even losing billions, these guys are still incredibly rich.
Oh, absolutely. They remain in a stratospheric financial league.
But does it show a kind of vulnerability? That even these huge fortunes aren't immune to policy shifts?
I think it does. The sheer size of the losses proves that macroeconomic policy decisions ripple all the way to the top. And Buffett's gain shows how the type of wealth and investment strategy matters in that environment.
Does it make you wonder about smaller players?
It does raise that point. If the giants are taking hits like this, could these policies disproportionately hammer smaller investors? People without the diversification or resources to ride out the storm, could it actually worsen the wealth gap? It's a valid question.
Looking at the policy side, the article calls the tariff outcomes mixed. Not exactly a clear win, even for the stated goals.
That seems to be the takeaway from the source, yes. It highlights significant collateral damage to globally connected sectors like tech and luxury.
Even if the aim was, say, boosting domestic industry.
Right. It shows the complexity. You pull one lever, but it affects many other parts of the machine. It forces policymakers to constantly weigh the intended benefits against these often widespread, sometimes unintended costs.
And the article mentions some policy considerations going forward, based on this analysis.
Yes, it touches on a few. Things like constantly reevaluating that cost-benefit balance for tariffs, maybe considering more targeted exemptions or ways to compensate industries hit particularly hard. And also that ongoing debate about strengthening domestic supply chains for critical things like semiconductors. The idea being to reduce reliance on imports and maybe lessen the impact of future trade disputes.
And just to be clear, these are considerations mentioned in the source material we're discussing.
Correct. We're reporting on the analysis and the policy points raised within that material, not endorsing any specific stance ourselves.
Okay, so if we were to summarize this whole deep dive, it looks like the 2025 tariff sequel had a really big, mostly negative impact on the world's super rich.
Largely, yes. Primarily hitting those heavily invested in global markets, especially tech and luxury. Their exposure was their vulnerability here.
But the Warren Buffett example shows that a different strategy, domestic focus, diversification, provided not just a shield, but actually a boost.
Exactly. That contrast within the top 10 is really powerful. It demonstrates just how varied and significant the effects of big economic policies can be, even at the absolute peak of wealth, depending on sector, strategy, exposure.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? If these are the waves hitting the biggest yachts, what are the undercurrents doing to smaller boats? What are the less visible effects on smaller businesses, on you as a consumer, on the whole web of the global economy?
It's a crucial reminder of how interconnected it all is. Global trade, policy decisions, individual finances, they're all linked.
Definitely something worth thinking more about on your own. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.